This is the first of two lectures on the foundations of behavioral welfare economics. I want to emphasize that these lectures are about foundations. I don't really get into applications here in any detail. I cover applications of behavioral welfare economics in my lectures on behavioral public economics. Before diving into the material, I want to provide a little bit of motivation. Models from behavioral economics are playing increasingly important roles in economic policy analysis and in policymaking. And in those settings, evaluation of the policy is essential. In other words, welfare analysis is a core analytic activity. Now, the problem is that standard welfare economics defers to choice. And the question we have to grapple with is whether this deference still makes sense if choices can be inconsistent, biased, and so forth. Behavioral welfare economics is a critical area of study because it provides the foundations for drawing normative conclusions when we find ourselves in these settings. This slide summarizes the plan for these lectures. We'll be covering 6 topics. We will begin with the question of what is welfare? What are we trying to measure? And what are the premises that provide the foundation for standard welfare economics? From there, I'll turn to a behavioral critique of standard welfare economics. What are the problems with standard welfare economics from the behavioral perspective? Next, we'll consider a method that I call behavioral revealed preference, which is the first approach that naturally occurs to an economist. And after discussing some problems with that approach, problems that are potentially quite severe, we will return to the foundations of welfare and try to formulate revised premises upon which to build a general framework for behavioral welfare economics, which is the 5th topic. And then after covering that general method, I'll then turn to some core empirical methods, which begins to cross over into applications, but we won't be studying any of those applications in detail. In this first lecture, I'll be addressing topics 1, 2, and 3. So let's begin with the first topic. What is welfare? What are we trying to measure? The following few slides constitutes an abbreviated version of a full lecture on welfare that I present in Econ 202. For those of you who are interested in the full version, I'll also make that lecture available. I'll begin by summarizing different philosophical accounts of well-being. Philosophers have been thinking about the definition of well-being literally for thousands of years. Modern philosophers tend to group theories of well-being into 3 different categories. The first school of thought is known as welfare hedonism. These theories hold that well-being consists solely in the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. By the way, the quotes on this slide are attributable to a philosopher named Shelley Kagan, and they're taken from a book on normative ethics. Within economics, welfare hedonism is commonly associated with the utilitarians, in particular Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham held that all pleasure is essentially homogeneous, and therefore greater well-being corresponds to having a larger quantity of pleasure. Now, modern economists tend to be more attracted to a version of this theory known as mental statism, which holds that welfare is exclusively a reflection of mental states, but not necessarily a matter of simply summing up one index of pleasure. And one can find the roots of mental statism in John Stuart Mill's writings. The second school of thought consists of desire theories or preference theories. And these hold that well-being consists in having one's desires satisfied. This school of thought provides the foundation for modern welfare economics. It's important to be clear about what this means. It means that well-being depends upon whether the actual state of the world is what the individual wants it to be, and not necessarily whether the individual knows this to be true. Now, there is a subtle variant of desire theory, which holds that the actual state of the world includes the individual's mental state. So if my desires only pertain to my own mental states, the desire theoretic approach would actually coincide with welfare hedonism. The final category of approaches is known as objective list theories. And these hold that well-being is a matter of having certain goods in one's life, goods that are simply worth having, objectively speaking. And the classic articulation of this perspective can be found in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, although there are quite a few modern philosophers who also advocate this point of view. To understand the sometimes conflicting implications of these various schools of thought, it helps to consider an example. And to that end, I will introduce an example that I call the case of the oblivious altruist. Imagine that a small town in Arkansas experiences massive flooding, leaving many families homeless. Now, Norman, our subject, is altruistic, and he'd contribute $100 to a relief fund if he knew about it. The government provides relief, and it pays for relief with taxes, including a $100 levy on Norman. And by the way, Norman does not like paying taxes. Now, Norman never learns about the flood or the relief effort. And the question is, does the relief effort improve or reduce his welfare? Now, if you are a welfare hedonist, you have to reach the conclusion that this program reduces his welfare. It will induce less attractive mental states because Norman will get angry about his taxes. In contrast, under simple desire theory or preference theory, we would be led to conclude that this policy increases Norman's welfare. If he knew about the need for his contribution, he would gladly put up his $100. So he is better off. The world is as he would want it to be. Now, from the perspective of subtle desire theory or preference theory, the answer to this question is ambiguous because Norman may care about his mental state. The right question to ask Norman here, from the perspective of that school of thought, is whether he prefers to live in a world where these sorts of needs will be addressed as they come up and he will pay for them, even though he won't know about them. And if Norman says, yes, I would rather live in a world like that because that's the right thing to do, then the policy makes him better off. On the other hand, if he says, no, I would not want to live in that world because paying these taxes and not realizing that they were being used for beneficial purposes would just make me really angry, and that would be very displeasurable to me. Well, in that case, he would be worse off, according to the application of the theory. And finally, from the point of view of objective list theories, we would probably say that the policy increases Norman's welfare. And the reason I say probably is that we don't have our objective list in front of us. But generally, these objective list theories say that doing virtuous things like providing money to support needy people benefits the individual who is making the contribution in terms of their own well-being. Now, several different approaches to welfare are available to us. So which account should we adopt? Well, the perspective adopted in behavioral economics applications is not always clear, and that's the source of much conceptual confusion. You often see someone beginning with implicitly a framework that's based on desire theory, and then slipping into arguments that essentially draw on a welfare hedonistic perspective. And this leads to much confusion about what these authors are doing. What we will do here is adopt the desire theoretic perspective or preference theoretic perspective. And I want to caution that there are philosophical objections to this approach. You can find them in the writings of various philosophers like Parfit and Hausmann. But I also think that there are answers to those objections. And I discuss some of the objections and the answers that I would give in my full lecture on the foundations of standard welfare economics. In going down the desire theoretic path, we are turning away from the other two approaches. So let me say a few words about why. First of all, welfare hedonism. There are conceptual problems associated with implementing it. And I would describe the most important problems as follows. Mental states are disaggregated. They're disaggregated over time. We have different mental states at different points in time. They're disaggregated across states of nature. If there's uncertainty and different realizations, your mental states will be different according to which realization occurred. I would argue that mental states are disaggregated even more finely than that. As I sit here at this moment, at a single point in time, in a single state of nature, I am not aware of having an aggregative mental state. I am aware of lots of disaggregated mental states. I'm aware of individual sensations. I'm aware of being hungry. I'm aware of being happy that it's the weekend and so forth. But introspecting, I can't find a single aggregative mental state that captures how well I feel. So whether we're talking about aggregation at a point in time, across time, or across states of nature, we are going to need a principle of aggregation. And it would have to be based on something other than mental states because by definition, that aggregate is not a mental state. So where would such a principle come from? Well, we'll need some judgment about the importance of different types of mental states. What judgments should we use? Well, one type of judgment would be choices. But if we use choices, we're back in the desire theoretic framework. The same is true if we use stated preferences. We're back in the desire theoretic framework, although we're using a different kind of data to identify desires. What about the objective list approach? Well, the obvious practical problem with that approach is that we need to know where the list comes from. How do we justify the items on it? Is this just a matter of intuition and introspection? There are some attempts to formalize objective lists approach. I put Sen's capability approach in this category. Martha Nussbaum, a modern philosopher, has written on this approach. Perhaps there are ways to go, but I think it's challenging. So in the rest of these lectures, we will follow the desire theoretic school of thought. Now I'll turn to our second topic, which is the behavioral critique of standard welfare economics. I'll begin by reviewing the basic differences between the standard and behavioral perspectives on choice. There are three foundational assumptions for the standard model. I call them limited concerns, frame independence or context independence, and internal consistency. And I'll run through each one of them in order. Let's start with the assumption of limited concerns. This assumption says that the dimensions of each consumption bundle encompass all of the aspects of experience that people care about. So when we write down little x, which is a consumption bundle, we are implicitly taking a stand on the limits of the consumer's concerns. Anything outside of that consumption bundle is something the individual doesn't care about. Now, it's important to emphasize that we cannot infer these limits on the boundaries of the consumption bundle from choice data. Why not? Well, it's because we don't know what constitutes choice data until we make this assumption. To gather choice data, we have to gather data on chosen consumption bundles, but we don't know what the bundles are until we make this assumption. Sometimes one hears economists assert that economics is the science of choice, that we make all of our inferences from choice data. But that can't be true because, as I said, there is no way to gather data on choice until we have defined the limits of the consumer's concerns. And so we cannot be addressing that question through choice data. Behavioral economics departs from standard economics by expanding the potential set of the individual's concerns. We imagine that people may care about things like fairness, reciprocity, social image, regret, anticipatory emotions, self-image, and so forth. The second assumption, context independence, says that decisions do not depend on the conditions of choice. It's important to keep in mind that a decision problem is more than just a menu containing simple descriptions of the options. It also involves the conditions under which the decision is made. We'll call that the frame and write it as little f. And there are many examples of this. For example, the point in time at which a decision is made, whether we choose between A and B for time t, at time t, or at time t minus 1. That difference can reverse our decision. The point in time at which we make the choice is the part of the decision frame. Other aspects of framing include the order in which component decisions are made in some composite choice, the manner in which alternatives or information are presented, the existence of a status quo or default option, and so forth. Now, in standard consumer theory, we write the choice correspondence as capital C of X. C maps menus into the items chosen from those menus. Behavioral economics, in contrast, allows for choice correspondences that take the form C of X comma F. In other words, the item chosen from X may depend not only on the menu, but also on the frame. And we call this a generalized choice problem. Why might we observe context dependence? Well, there are several reasons. One reason is that the framing of the choice problem may either impair or improve the consumer's understanding of the opportunity set, conditional on the available information. So we may present the same choice problem to the individual in two different ways. The information and the opportunities are the same in both cases, and yet the individual makes a different choice in one instance compared to the other because he or she understood the problem better in the one instance than in the other. Another potential source of context dependence is that framing may affect the construction of judgments. And this notion of constructed judgments or constructed preferences is an extremely important one in psychology. And I think economists need to take it quite seriously. The idea is as follows. As we go through life, our experiences are highly disaggregated, and the way we evaluate those experiences from moment to moment uh, tend to be highly disaggregated. You may be sitting there at this very moment, on the one hand, thinking that you're bored, or that you're excited, or that you're hungry, or that you are happily anticipating what you're going to do this evening. And all of those thoughts, all of those evaluations are running through your mind at the same time. Now, some of the time we are called upon to render aggregate judgments. For example, sometimes we're asked to make a choice, or sometimes we're asked, how do you feel overall? And in those situations, we have to take all these disparate aspects of our experience and somehow put them together, assemble them into a view about whether I want one thing rather than another, or how happy I am. Now, here's the important point. I don't think we can render these judgments by consulting our true preferences or by accessing our aggregate experienced utility, because these things, as far as I can tell, don't actually exist. Instead, what we do is construct or assemble our aggregate judgment separately within each context. As I said, this is an idea in psychology that has gained a lot of traction. So context dependence may result from the context sensitivity of the aggregation process. This is not to say that we will do completely different things in different contexts. It's hard to imagine a context that would induce me to choose, for example, 5 years in prison over going out to dinner at a nice restaurant. So there are limits to context dependence. However, within those limits, the context may make one aspect of my experience more or less salient than another. It may cause me to place more or less weight on one aspect of my experience than another. And by virtue of those types of effects, we may see people making context dependent preferences. Now, the last possibility in terms of a source for context dependence is what I would call false context dependence, that the individual's concerns are defined too narrowly. And that is one possible response that we could have when we see evidence of context dependence. We could say, oh, well, what this is showing me is that there is an aspect of the context that falls within the scope of the consumer's concerns. And as we'll see, that approach may make sense in some situations, but there are other situations in which it's pretty hard to justify. The third assumption in the standard approach is internal consistency. And it says that the choice correspondence C satisfies the weak axiom of revealed preference. We know that the existence of as-if preferences and utility functions follows immediately from this assumption, at least for the case where we have finite consumption sets, and these results can, of course, be extended with some additional technical requirements. Now, behavioral economics, in contrast, allows for violations of warp entirely apart from context dependence. And consequently, I've sometimes used the term unwarped economics to describe what we do in behavioral economics. And there are many phenomena that take this form. Choice overload is one example. Having too many options can be a bad thing rather than a good thing, as suggested by standard theory. Menu salience is another kind of phenomenon. Certain things on menus may leap out at you. Default effects fall into this category, and so forth. Now I'll turn to welfare, and in particular to the premises that provide the foundation for standard welfare economics. There are three premises, and they fall into two categories. The first category consists of the desire theoretic premises. These premises are what make the standard approach to welfare an articulation of the desire theoretic school of thought. The first premise asserts that each of us is the best judge of our own well-being. We can give several types of arguments for this premise. First, we have justifications for self-determination in the tradition of classical liberalism. My judgments about my life are paramount because, after all, it is my life. Alternatively, we can rely on the Cartesian principle that experience, subjective experience, is inherently private and not directly observable. And for that reason, I am the only expert on my own subjective experience. And therefore, I deserve deference when it comes to the normative evaluation of my own experience. The second premise is that we each have coherent, stable preferences. These preferences embody our desires. Then we have what I call the implementation premise. And that's premise number three. Our preferences guide our choices. When we choose, we seek to benefit ourselves. Putting those three together gives us a foundation for what we do in standard welfare economics. Now, of course, it's possible to criticize each one of these premises. And consequently, there are three different categories of critiques of the standard approach to welfare analysis. The first type of critique I call the judgment critique. Here, the argument is simply that people have bad objectives, that they are not the best judges of their own well-being. This critique challenges premise number one. Second, we have challenges to premise number two. I call this the coherence critique. The assertion is that coherent, stable preferences do not exist. And we can give a variety of arguments in favor of this critique. The judgments are likely constructed, not accessed. The notions of true preferences and aggregate experienced utility are fictions, and that choices are therefore sensitive to apparently irrelevant contextual features of decision problems, like the salience of certain options or aspects of experience. Finally, we can challenge the third premise by making an implementation critique. Here, the argument is that people have difficulty making choices that advance their own objectives, whatever they are. Now, from my perspective, there's a lot of force behind the coherence critique and the implementation critique. I am less persuaded that there's much force behind the judgment critique. You can't make a true judgment critique and stay within the desire theoretic framework. As long as we remain within that framework, we would look at these critiques and say, well, this is simply a disagreement between the individual and the analyst, and there's no reason to give the analyst priority. Now I'll turn to our third topic, which is behavioral revealed preference. This is a common approach to conducting behavioral welfare economics. Many economists are reluctant to relinquish either of the desire theoretic premises of standard welfare economics. They are determined to retain premise two, the assumption that people have coherent, stable preferences, as well as premise one, the normative dictum that those preferences ought to govern welfare analysis. However, in recognition of the implementation critique, they are willing to accept that the connection between preferences and choices is imperfect. In other words, they're willing to live with a weakened version of premise three. And that strategy, weakening premise three while retaining premises one and two, leads us to this method that I call behavioral revealed preference. So let me describe the modeling strategy used for this method in a bit more detail. What the analyst does is supplement the standard model of choice with additional elements representing cognitive biases, where these cognitive biases purportedly account for the imperfections of implementation. The approach then consists of several elements. First of all, we assume that there's a utility function that rationalizes choices, and we write it as u of x and f. This utility function maps consumption bundles to levels of utility, but that mapping depends upon the frame f. We don't think of f here as part of the consumption bundle. The individual doesn't have preferences over f. Rather, preferences over x are conditioned on f. Sometimes this function is called decision utility because it governs decisions. Sometimes it's called ex ante utility, although I'm going to discourage you in a bit from using that term. The next element of this approach is a function that allows us to evaluate welfare according to some normative objective. And we write that function as v of x. And then loosely, the difference, and I write it here as little b of x comma f, it's just the difference between u and v, evaluated at the consumption bundle X, given the frame F, that difference reflects bias. Now, I say loosely, and it's important to emphasize that I mean it loosely, because you should remember that the information contained in utility functions is ordinal and not cardinal. So when I write down a difference like this, I'm actually endowing these functions with cardinal interpretations, which I don't really want to do. So when I write bias down this way, I simply want you to understand that we're thinking of bias here as the discrepancy between U and V. And if we want to be technical about it, it's the discrepancy of the ordinal information contained in those two functions. And now I'll state what I take to be the basic principle of behavioral revealed preference, which is that if enough is known about the process mapping preferences to choices, in other words, if we know enough about the bias function, B, the structure of that function, then we can recover preferences and bias parameters simultaneously from choice data. In standard economics, we have a mapping from preference parameters to choices, which we can invert to recover the preference parameters. Here we have a mapping from preference parameters and bias parameters to choices, which we can invert under appropriate conditions to recover both the preference parameters and the bias parameters. That's what this approach is all about. Now, I want to make one final point, which should be fairly obvious from what I said about the previous slide, which is that this approach does not address the coherence critique. It doesn't address the judgment critique either, but I'm not too worried about that. I am worried about the fact that it does not address the coherence critique. It continues to maintain the fiction that we have well-defined, coherent, stable preferences, and that we make our choices by accessing those preferences. And there is simply no basis in psychology for thinking that that's what we do. On the contrary, we likely construct our judgments in what is a context-dependent way. There is no room for that critique in this approach. And as you'll see, that leads to some pretty significant problems. Now I'm going to describe the main challenges that we face when we try to implement the behavioral revealed preference approach. And there are three main challenges, which I list on this slide. I'm going to be going through them one by one. So let's start with the first one, which is the challenge of specifying the consumer's limited concerns. Let me begin with the observation here that all choice-oriented welfare methods, no matter what they are, require the analyst to take a stand on the aspects of experience that consumers care about and that consequently contribute to well-being. If you don't take such a stand, you can't describe a consumption bundle, so there's no way you can get started. There's no way we can avoid this problem. Once you take such a stand, the identity of decision frames, which are conditions that consumers don't care about intrinsically, they're outside of the consumption bundle, but that nevertheless affect choices, the identities of those decision frames follows directly from the definition of the consumption bundle. If we assume that the consumer has coherent and well-behaved preferences, then these framing effects necessarily imply the existence of biases. If I choose consumption bundle A over consumption bundle B in one frame, but choose consumption bundle B over consumption bundle A in another frame, it can't be the case that in both of those instances, I'm adhering to my well-behaved neoclassical preferences. It must be that at least one of those decisions exhibits a bias relative to these true preferences, whatever they are. On this slide, I present an example that's intended to illuminate this issue of drawing the line between the consumption bundle and the frames. And I call this example Norman's lunch. You'll see as we go along, all of the individuals in my examples are named either Norma or Norman. And the reason for that is that, after all, this is normative analysis. In any case, let's suppose we ask Norman to order his lunch for a scheduled meeting 1 week in advance. And whether he selects a sandwich or a salad may depend on whether he's asked to decide at 1 p.m., just after he's eaten, or at 4 p.m. when he's hungry. And this is based on the empirical pattern documented in the paper by Reed and Van Leeuwen. Now, here, the natural assumption is that the preference domain encompasses food items, and that the time at which Norman makes his choice is the frame, F. And that frame may either influence the construction of his judgments, or it may distort the expression of those judgments into choices. For example, because hunger disrupts cognition in some fashion. You'll notice, however, that this fact pattern admits another interpretation, which is that Norman's well-being depends not just on the food he eats, but also on what he orders and when he orders it, that his intrinsic concerns encompass the experience of ordering. And under that assumption, capital X, the set of options, consists of bundles specifying both orders and meals. And there are no decision frames, and we can rationalize Norman's choices that way. Now, that may not be a very plausible rationalization of Norman's choices. It's hard to imagine a legitimate reason why he would think there is some sort of complementarity between his experience of ordering and his experience of consuming 1 week later. But let's leave that aside. If one were determined to rationalize this pattern without frames, one could do it. So this second interpretation of Norman's behavior suggests a variant of the behavioral revealed preference approach, wherein the analyst just expands the assumed boundaries of the consumer's concerns until all the inconsistencies just disappear. And then we proceed as if there are no biases at all. So an example of this would be the theory of temptation preferences as formulated by Gould and Pessendorfer, which accounts for apparent choice reversals without assuming time inconsistency. It says that those reversals are not actually reversals because the bundle that people really care about is more complicated. It includes the set from which they're choosing because the options that are in that set can make them experience temptation, which is unpleasant when they choose something else. Now, in any given practical application, when we try to draw this line, two issues arise. The first is that we need an objective method for drawing the lines between decision frames and elements of the consumption bundle. How do we know which is which? And then second, depending on how we draw this line, it turns out that welfare analysis may not be possible, at least with choice data. So let's take a closer look at each one of those issues. So let's turn to issue number one. We would like to have objective methods for drawing the line between decision frames and elements of the consumption bundle. And such methods need to rely on non-choice evidence for the reasons that I've described previously. In principle, we can rationalize virtually any behavior as a reflection of either framing effects or exotic preferences. Remember that evidence on choice isn't even available until one defines the boundaries of the consumption bundles. So if we're going to draw this line, we've got to rely on something other than choice. What are the possible options? Well, we can ask people what they care about. We can introspect. We can identify conditions that affect choice through channels other than preferences. For example, ones that cause confusion about the options. Now, I'm listing a bunch of possibilities, but I'm not describing any formal methods. And the reason for that is that formal methods still remain underdeveloped. This is an aspect of the behavioral welfare framework that could use a lot more attention. Now I'll turn to the second issue, which is that drawing the line between decision frames and the elements of the consumption bundle in certain ways may preclude us from doing welfare analysis. This assertion is a reflection of what I call the non-comparability problem. The non-comparability problem tells us that if the experience of choosing falls within the scope of the consumer's concerns, then welfare is not recoverable from choice. Well, that's a disturbing statement. Let's see why it's true. Here's a way to conceptualize the general non-comparability problem. Choice-based welfare analysis is making prescriptions for a planner. It's saying this is what the planner should do for the individual by asking what the affected consumer would choose if the affected consumer were offered the same alternatives. What we want to do is have the planner mimic the consumer. Now, in situations where the consumer's concerns encompass the experience of choosing, the planner's task and the consumer's task are inherently non-comparable. Presenting the planner and the consumer with, at least ostensibly, the same menu doesn't mean that the alternatives, correctly defined, are actually the same. So, for example, if Norma's well-being depends not only on what she chooses, but also on what she personally chooses to forego, her choices can't shed light on the best choice for a planner because she personally chooses to forego nothing when the planner makes the selection for her. This is the essence of the problem. Here's a simple illustration that shows how seemingly very sensible assumptions about the consumer's concerns can lead to difficulties. So in this example, Norma has to divide $10 between herself and a friend. And Norma is averse to bearing responsibility for leaving her friend with nothing when other options are available. And consequently, no matter how the task is framed, she divides the money equally. However, Norma is actually inherently selfish, and she fervently wishes someone would come along and take the decision out of her hands and give her the entire prize. Now, the point is that there is no choice problem that can reveal the preferences we've assumed Norma actually has. In particular, you might think, well, let's let Norma choose between two choice situations, one in which she divides the money herself, and the other in which there's a third party who makes the decision and gives her everything. Then she can express this preference by deciding to have that third party make the decision. But notice that she then remains responsible for the outcome. And the hypothesis about her preferences is that as long as she is responsible for the outcome, she's going to feel guilty and take the option that ends up with equal division. So you would never be able to use such choices to elicit her true preferences. A planner mimicking her choices would simply say, Norma likes equal division, I will divide things equally for her, and that planner would get it wrong from Norma's perspective. This slide provides a formal articulation of the non-comparability problem. So let's let capital S stand for a choice problem. So it includes both an opportunity set and a frame. We'll let little x be an object, and we'll let x star of S be the object chosen from this set. Now, if we allow for preferences of this form, that utility depends upon little x, the bundle that I choose, as well as potentially any aspect of the choice problem, then when we observe the choice of the individual, all we can say is that this weak inequality holds, that the individual receives greater utility from choosing X star coupled with the decision situation S than the utility that they would derive from any other X in this choice situation. This is the only inequality that we can infer from the choice. So for any two choice problems, S and S prime, you simply can't say which is greater. Utility evaluated at X star of S along with S, or utility evaluated at X star of S prime along with S prime. Here's another way to make the same point. Let's suppose the function u of x comma s rationalizes the individual's choices over the consumption bundles. It doesn't rationalize their choices over the decision problems S. because you can't choose over decision problems. If you give a choice over decision problems, that's just another decision problem. So it rationalizes their choice of little x conditional on the decision problem. If it does that, then so does a function of this form. We just take u of x comma s and add f of s for any function f. This also rationalizes precisely the same choices. And consequently, two different choice situations, s and s prime, are completely unrankable. We can make their ranking anything we want. So in particular, if we're interested in a situation where the planner, the government, has to actually choose a consumption bundle for the individual, which leads to a setting where the individual is just stuck with the option X. We'll call that choice problem, that degenerate choice problem, just S sub X. In that case, U of X comma S sub X is completely unidentified. You can't compare it to anything else. So if the planner is choosing between giving the consumer X, which actually means the consumer gets X along with S sub X, and the alternative is to give the consumer Y, which means that the consumer actually gets Y and S sub Y, well, there's just no way to compare X coupled with S sub X with Y coupled with S sub Y. So what can we do to avoid the non-comparability problem? One approach is to simply assume that consumers' concerns don't encompass conditions pertaining specifically to the experience of choosing. I sometimes call these conditions of choice, as opposed to conditions of experience. That's an assumption that will eliminate the problem. It is a strong assumption, but maybe we can live with the assumption that conditions of choice don't matter very much. For example, because the experience of choice is brief. It's not that they don't matter at all, but if they don't matter very much, then as an approximation, we can ignore them. A second possibility is to assume that the consumer only cares about the conditions of choice under well-defined circumstances. For example, we could assume that people don't care about the conditions of choice when choosing over future choice sets. So in particular, Crissell, Carusco, and Smith in a 2010 paper used this strategy to make welfare judgments in the context of temptation preferences. Those are some possibilities. I'm actually working on another possibility now with Dmitry Taubinsky, and I hope eventually to add to this list. Now let's turn to the second challenge that we face when we use the behavioral revealed preference method. And that's the challenge of identifying biases. Implementation of this method requires the analyst to recover V, the normative utility function, as well as U, the decision utility function. To do so, we have to have a clear understanding of what V is. And there are several potential interpretations of V. One interpretation that you sometimes hear is that V is experienced utility, or you could say ex post utility. The second is that V represents true preferences, whatever those are. And the third, which may be the least obvious, but I'm going to argue that it's the most theoretically compelling, is that V is another kind of decision utility. So let me go through each one of these. Let's start with the first interpretation, that V, the normative objective function, is experienced or ex post utility. That interpretation has gained a lot of traction. For example, Raj Chetty adopted it in his Eli lecture. However, it's important to realize that this approach is conceptually problematic. In the first place, this interpretation seems to confuse welfare perspectives. It appears to be slipping into welfare hedonism by equating welfare with the ex post hedonic experience, which need not be the case in desire theory. But I suppose it could be the case. So let's leave that aside and talk more specifically about the problems that arise with this interpretation. The first problem is that the assumption that people derive welfare only from experience is limiting because it excludes non-experiential objectives. It excludes the possibility that we simply care about the truth. Let me give an example. This example involves two scenarios. In both of these scenarios, you spend your life as an academic, and early in your career, you write a paper that turns out to be very famous, and it makes your reputation. And you enjoy this reputation until you die. Now, in the first scenario, after your death, your paper continues to be regarded as a classic. In the second scenario, it turns out after your death that your paper contained a tragic error, which made everything in it completely wrong. Ask yourself, do you care whether you're in one scenario versus another? If you care, you derive welfare from the truth, from reality, and not simply from your own experience. The second problem is that there are natural and important settings in which experience cannot logically include the aggregate welfare evaluation V. Just to give some illustrations of contexts in which it starts to become problematic, think about a setting with uncertainty. We have different states of nature that could be realized. In fact, one of those states of nature will be realized, and that's the experience that you will have. However, when you're making your decision, if you're an expected utility maximizer, V represents expected utility. Now, you don't experience expected utility. You experience one outcome. And V is a judgment about the relative importance of the various outcomes. Similar problems arise in the intertemporal setting. We experience utility intertemporally, period by period. But when we describe a consumer's intertemporal allocation problem, we write down a utility function U that aggregates intertemporally. So when do we experience that aggregate utility? Apparently not in any particular period. So in most cases that economists care about, it doesn't really make sense to say that V is hedonically experienced. It's more of a judgment. Well, now let's talk about the second interpretation, which is that V, the normative objective function, is true preferences, and that a biased choice is one that's contrary to true preferences. This is a common view, and you hear this view being expressed with some frequency. That doesn't have the same conceptual problems as the first interpretation, since U and V are now both the same type of objects. They're both ex ante desires. It's just that they differ. The question is, how would we learn about the individual's true preferences, this V function, in applications? The dominant approach is to assume, often implicitly, that there's a decision frame for which bias is absent, a frame F for which the utility functions U and V actually coincide, at least ordinally. And therefore, this second interpretation of V ultimately boils down to interpretation number 3, which is that V is a form of decision utility for choices that are not infected by bias. And that's really the right way to think about it. We aren't distinguishing here between U being decision utility and V being something else. U is decision utility, V is decision utility. But U tells you the decision utility that would apply in effect for any frame, whereas V tells you the decision utility that would apply for the right frame, whatever that means. And that's something we'll have to clarify. I think it's helpful to clarify these concepts by looking at a few examples. The first example involves bias beliefs. And when we're talking about bias beliefs, the existence of frames for which bias is absent is an implicit assumption. Why do I say that? Well, let's assume that Norman chooses the bundle X to maximize this utility function. He's just an expected utility maximizer. The choice of X leads to outcome Y, and little g of Y given X represents Norman's subjective beliefs. These are the savage weights for Norman. Now, the analyst infers that the objective distribution of y given x is actually something else. And the analyst therefore evaluates welfare according to this alternative function. And what we're doing is just swapping the objective probabilities for the savage weights. Now, the question is, why is that okay? What does it mean to swap objective probabilities for savage weights? These are apples and oranges. So can we swap them? Does that make sense? Well, this substitution is based on an implicit assumption, which is that in a setting where the consumer knew the objective probabilities, where we could convince them that the distribution was actually F and not G, so in that setting there would be no bias, then V of X would govern her choices. And in principle, that assumption is actually testable because you can provide someone with objective information about distributions or place them in a situation where distributions are objective and see what they do. Now, I want to close my discussion of this example with one additional observation that I think is really quite interesting. You can see that this normative utility function really is implementing a desire theoretic standard. And what do I mean by that? Well, in using the justification that I've given for this normative objective function, we're saying that welfare reflects the degree to which the consumer's true ex ante desires are actually satisfied, even though she doesn't know that they're being satisfied. She may believe that the distribution is G and not F, but we're evaluating her well-being according to V. So that's very much adopting the desire theoretic perspective. Now, I've argued that the third interpretation, that the normative objective function is a form of decision utility, is the most coherent of the three possibilities. Unfortunately, it leads us into what I call the circularity trap. And the trap works as follows. The idea is that we're supposed to identify bias by looking for choices that conflict with true preferences. But we also infer true preferences from choices that are not biased. So how do we start this process? A key challenge in behavioral welfare economics is finding an escape route from the circularity trap. In other words, a way of identifying bias without reference to preferences. And here, I'm afraid I've inserted a somewhat uncharitable reference to much of the literature, which is, I know it when I see it, is not a sound methodological principle. In practical applications, identifying the bias choices can be extremely challenging. So in the example involving Norman's lunch, you could argue that hunger might cloud Norman's judgment, or you could argue that hunger focuses Norman's attention. Let me give some other examples that I think drive this point home. My first example concerns framing effects involving weather. A number of papers have found that decisions with no immediate consequences are sensitive to the weather at the moment of choice. I like this paper by Meyer et al. Quite a bit because it shows that when people vote, how they vote on the day they vote depends upon the weather on that day. But of course, the consequences are all far off in time. So would we conclude from this observation that rain causes irrational depression? Or does sunshine cause irrational exuberance? What are the true preferences here? We see frame dependence, and the framing isn't plausibly part of the consumer's consumption bundle. So how do we know which is the right preference and which is the wrong one? And you can tell that lurking behind this question is the coherence critique, which this behavioral revealed preference approach has avoided. It has not addressed. It can't come to grips with the fact that both of these choices may reflect constructed judgments. Neither is more true than the other. My second example concerns time inconsistent behavior. How should we evaluate it? So our standard model of quasi-hyperbolic preferences, which you're familiar with, the beta-delta model, looks like this. This is the intertemporal aggregator. Now, a widespread view is that unbiased choices are ones that are made in period zero with full commitment. And this amounts to using what's sometimes called the long run criterion, which is we discount by delta and we ignore beta. And that reflects the supposition that present focus is a bias. But I think we need to stop and ask ourselves what principles and or evidence support that perspective. In the first place, pejorative views of present focus are not universal. To take an example, Zen Buddhism teaches that we all need to learn to live in the moment, which sounds a lot like present focus. Second observation is that deathbed regrets tend to favor present focus. Very few people on their deathbeds say, gee, I really wish that in my life I had been more future focused and that I had spent more time working hard at the office. Most of them say, I wish I had spent more time enjoying my life and spending time with my family and friends. So one question I like to pose here is whether the long run criterion is simply a reflection of what I like to call type A paternalism. And what I mean by that is that the people who work on this topic, behavioral economists, psychologists, are all very successful type A people. And is this just a matter of those people living more in the future than in the present and saying that living in the present is a mistake? People should be more like us and be more future oriented. How do we objectively resolve these questions? For my third example, I want to come back to the case of biased beliefs. Now, in settings where objective probabilities are known, there are plausible ways to assess whether beliefs about those probabilities are biased. Kosegi and Rabin have described some strategies. You can think, for example, about flipping a coin multiple times, having people bet on whether it's heads or tails. And when you see a string of heads, if people start betting on tails, that means that they think that tails is due, not, I think, that they care about the state of nature in which tails is realized intrinsically in a way that's tipping their preferences in that direction. So that's a reasonable inference in that context. But how do we determine whether beliefs are biased in settings with subjective probabilities? If we accept the Savage framework and say, gee, there's a lot of economic decisions where we truly don't know what the objective probabilities are. For example, a belief about the probability of a recession within the next year. What's the right answer and what's the wrong answer? So if beliefs are subjective rather than objective, how do we tell if they're biased? Now we'll turn to the third challenge facing practitioners of the behavioral revealed preference approach. And this is what I call the rigid consistency requirement. It's important to recognize that if you apply the behavioral revealed preference approach, this requires you to identify biases so that the implied unbiased choices are internally consistent in the sense that they satisfy warp, because that's what allows you to recover the true preferences. The use of this approach may therefore force you to make assumptions about bias that in the first place are highly suspect in light of the coherence critique. Remember the example of choices depending upon the weather. Are we really going to feel comfortable declaring that sunshine creates bias or that rain creates bias? Second, you may have to make assumptions about bias that lack objective supporting evidence and that go beyond your understanding of choice processes. And finally, you may even have to make assumptions that are inconsistent with the evidence. And I give the example here of this paper by Benjamin, Fontana, and Kimball, which tries to elicit true risk preferences by cleaning risk preference data, by trying to get people to respond to their inconsistencies in ways that tell the analyst which choices are the right ones and which ones are the wrong ones. And even after their cleaning process, a lot of inconsistencies still remain. So what do we do with those? Do we just assume those away? I think the important thing to realize is that if we take the coherence critique seriously, then when you ask the question, which frame causes a bias in the context of the weather example, which weather causes a bias? If people are constructing their preferences contextually, the answer may be none. It may be that all of those choices are true judgments, which the individual simply makes in different contexts because they're constructing their judgments differently. It may be that those conflicting choices simply represent different judgments which people make in different circumstances, and all of them are equally valid. On this slide, I've listed once again the three challenges that we face when we try to deploy the behavioral revealed preference approach. And what I want to emphasize here is that the inflexible consistency requirement prevents us from developing an objective and rigorous approach to the second challenge, which is the challenge of identifying biases, and probably to the first challenge as well. Why do I say that? Well, if we start from a set of general principles for diagnosing biases in choices, there's simply no guarantee that in a particular application, we'll end up reducing the choice domain to an internally consistent subset. And moreover, there's no hope of success in that endeavor at all if people construct their preferences contextually. So, for example, it's possible that upon applying sound principles, we might conclude that Norman's choices at 1 p.m. and 4 p.m., or choices made on rainy days and sunny days, are equally valid. What then? The behavioral revealed preference approach then says, well, throw your principles out the window, go back to step 2 and start crossing out more choices, make whatever assumptions you need so that you end up getting something that's internally consistent. And that's not a procedure that's conducive to consistently applying sound principles. In light of these difficulties, we need a good alternative to behavioral revealed preference.